is Al-Ittijah News TV, and I'm Balsam Al-Atrash coming to you live from Gaza Strip, where the Israeli forces have resumed their onslaught as the Palestinian death toll exceeds the 1,000 mark.
And I'm Fatima Basim in our Beirut studios with the rest of our headlines. It's crunch time in Paris. An army of international diplomats push for a long-term ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. Thousands rally across European cities protesting against the Israeli aggression in Gaza. And militants in Iraq continue with their destruction of the country's heritage, leveling more mosques and churches in Mosul. Well, the short-lived ceasefire between the Israelis and Palestinians is now officially over, as the Israelis renewed their airstrikes against the Gaza Strip. This as the civilian death toll in the coastal enclave climbed to over 1,000. Meanwhile, the Palestinian resistance groups are fighting back, firing rockets against major Israeli cities, including Tel Aviv. To give us the latest, we have our Gaza correspondent, Balsam Al-Atrash, standing by. Balsam, what more are you hearing?
Yes, the Palestinian resistance groups are resuming their fire rocket launching against the Israeli southern settlements from the Gaza Strip, where about 1 minute ago there was a barrage of rockets fired towards the Israeli settlements, Netivot, Ashkul, Ashkelon, Ashdod, also Tel Aviv as well. Sirens have been sounded there actually for about 2 hours now, as the Palestinian resistance groups resume their rocket launching against these settlements.
Yes, and what areas are the Israelis targeting in the Gaza Strip since the truce was broken?
Yes, since the truce has been over, the Israeli occupation forces have continued with their air raids and airstrikes. The latest was on Rafah area, where the Israeli warplanes raided the area with dozens of air raids. It was the eastern border of the area. Also, there was a Palestinian just killed in the eastern area of Deir al-Balah. He was sniped by the Israeli troops against the border. We can still hear right now, as we speak, Palestinian rockets fired towards the Israeli settlements.
And why did Hamas reject the extension of the ceasefire?
Hamas said that it was not informed by the extension of the ceasefire, 4-hour extension, and that it had agreed with the UN and the Israeli side on a ceasefire that includes 12-hour ceasefire from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and that the 4-hour extension, they were not informed by it and they do not agree on it. As well as this ceasefire was a humanitarian ceasefire, which means that Hamas does not want the people to understand that it stopped the firing of the rockets and it stopped the war. Since Israelis are the one who began the war in the first place, and Hamas right now is firing back and retaliating and fighting for their rights in order for the siege to be lifted and in order for all their terms to be met.
Tell us more about this short-lived humanitarian truce. How has it helped Palestinians who have been going through 20 days of Israeli attacks?
The humanitarian truce actually was 12 hours today. It started from 8 a.m. this morning till 8 p.m. Palestinians here tried to take good advantage of it and provide themselves with the necessaries. It was actually good for the Palestinians since they have been under war or under attack for around 20 days now. Medical teams got an opportunity or a chance to enter some of the areas in the eastern areas or close to the border in order to evacuate evacuate or reveal some of the bodies that had been there since the beginning of the ground invasion. Also, another medical teams and ambulances also managed to reach some of the houses that still had residents in them but had no access to water or power or other food supplies, as they helped provide them with such services. Also, the humanitarian aids helped the hospitals as well. The movement in the street today was returning a little bit to normal. The cleaning workers actually had gone on the streets and began cleaning the streets as the Palestinian municipalities also resumed their work in order for the humanitarian situation here, or the cleaning situation, or the hygiene situation, the pollution, not to exceed and become an exaggerating problem. So they continued their work and began to clean the streets. The bodies that the medical teams found in the areas that were banned and prevented to enter during the ground invasion and during the clashes in the Shijaiya area were actually decomposed and burnt. They would cause diseases in the area, so they needed to evacuate the bodies as soon as possible. The number of bodies found so far are 147, which raises the death toll so far to 1,047 Palestinians killed and over 6,000 injured. Also, Palestinians here in the central city of Gaza and other areas moving towards the center also used this humanitarian aid in order to go out and check on some of the schools that had some of the refugees in them and help them as well. Also, they went to provide themselves with basic necessities, as I said, for their homes, water, power, and so on, even food items.
How difficult is it to move around Gaza? Give us a sense of the situation in the besieged strip at the moment.
Currently, since the truce has ended and the Israeli troops had breached the truce and the ceasefire, the situation and the transportation is difficult. Even in the past 20 days during the war, transportation and moving around in the Gaza Strip during night hours is critical. Ambulances, any medical vehicle that would move after the daylight would be targeted by the Israeli warplanes. Also, for the residents, they do not move or leave their homes after or since the beginning or as the night begins. Also, the transportation here is difficult because the northern area is separated from the central area and separated from the southern area by the war zone. The war zone lies here between parts of the Gaza Strip. We have Nitsarim part. This is the area that separates the northern area from the southern area. This is the area where all the clashes and the gunfire on goes. And this is the only road that connects the northern parts with the southern parts, which means that the northern parts of the Gaza Strip is disconnected from the southern parts. Some of our teams or press teams can't even manage to get to areas such as Khan Yunis, since they lie in the southern, and even see what is going on there. We only call eyewitnesses on the phone and other co-workers in order to ask them what is going on. But here in the north, we cannot go or move forward towards the south since the beginning of the war. But since the beginning of the ground invasion began, also it has become more difficult for us to transport or move around across the Gaza Strip.
All right, Bansam Alatrash, our Gaza correspondent, thank you for giving us the latest. Well, that humanitarian ceasefire that was agreed on by the Israelis and Palestinians had cleared the way for Gazans to count their casualties. Bodies were pulled out from the rubble as civilians returned to their homes to assess the damage and salvage whatever they can before the Israelis resumed their assaults.
The Israelis have dropped their weapons, but just for 12 hours. Israeli troops left their positions along the Gaza border as soon as a humanitarian ceasefire entered into force. The soldier went straight to a cafe to meet his wife and son, but while he held his baby in his arms, Palestinians in Gaza were wrapping their children in shrouds of mourning. Beneath mountains of rubble, many Palestinians lay lifeless after weeks of Israeli bombardment. For them, the ceasefire came a little too late. At least 130 bodies have been retrieved since this morning, raising the death toll from the Israeli aggression against Gaza to over 1,000, an appalling figure that is expected to rise throughout the day. Many Gazans returned to their homes after the ceasefire was announced, or at least to where their homes used to stand, and looked for whatever they could find to assemble their life back in one piece.
I am picking up the pieces of memories, the photographs, and the life that I lost and was destroyed. There's barely anything left.
We are scared. There are rockets on our rooftops, and there are explosives here on the ground, as you can see.
If the walls of this hospital could speak, they would be speechless after witnessing the systematic targeting of civilians by the Israelis.
Today was a very scary night for the team in the hospital and the patients in the hospital because the Israeli occupation forces targeted the hospital with many shells.
The 12-hour truce pushed many Gazans to question the humanity of the sides that brokered it as they rushed to the markets to stock up on supplies before Israeli attacks resume.
What does a humanitarian truce mean? What is a human will be to finish the occupation and end all of this, not to be human only for 10 hours. What will happen after the 10 hours pass?
When we heard about the truce, we went out and found the streets full of people. Everyone is out. They want to see their houses, their children, and to earn money.
This is Gaza, reduced to ashes. For nearly 3 weeks, Israeli warplanes battered the besieged enclave with indiscriminate airstrikes, leaving its infrastructure in ruins. But picking up the pieces after yet another war will not be a first, as Gaza is used to rising from the ashes.
Following their meeting in Paris, top diplomats from the US, Europe and the Middle East called for an extension of the Gaza truce as efforts to secure a long-term ceasefire intensify. Speaking to reporters earlier, US Secretary of State John Kerry said he was hopeful that a long-term sustainable ceasefire in the Gaza Strip can be reached.
Now, I want to express my appreciation for the enormous amount of work that both Foreign Minister Atiyah and Foreign Minister Davutoglu engaged in the last days to help bring about the short-term ceasefire that we all hope is going to be extended into a longer-term ceasefire where people can get together and work on the way forward for a sustainable ceasefire, a longer-term effort to work out the difficult issues between the State of Israel and the Palestinian factions. We're very hopeful that that can happen. But I will tell you the progress that we've made was significantly contributed to by many people. And we're grateful, obviously, for the Egyptian initiative, for the Israeli efforts initially, but also this particular effort now has been significantly assisted by the input of Qatar, the input of Turkey, and the willingness of these foreign ministers to work hard, even though they were at a distance, and to engage directly with some of the Palestinian factions in order to try to help get us where we are today. They're both committed to trying to work to continue further, and we very much appreciate that.
It's crunch time in Paris. Top international diplomats are scrambling to end the bloody Israeli onslaught against the Gaza Strip. The summit in the French capital kicked off with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry holding talks with his counterparts from Qatar, Turkey, France, Britain, Germany and Italy to put diplomatic pressure on the Israelis to halt its military operation in Gaza. The seven-nation army of top diplomats called for a humanitarian extension for the current ceasefire, which ends at 8 p.m. local time.
All of us call on the parties to extend the military ceasefire that is currently underway. All of us want to obtain as quickly as possible a durable negotiated ceasefire that responds both to Israeli needs in terms of security and Palestinian needs in terms of the socio-economic development of Gaza and access to the territory of Gaza.
Earlier, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry met Turkish Foreign Ministers Ahmet Davutoglu and discussed other possible approaches to reaching a durable ceasefire. But how far is Washington willing to push Tel Aviv? The Israelis have already rejected a U.S.-sponsored ceasefire proposal on Friday, indicating that they are ready to push on with their massacre of Palestinians. An Israeli colonel confirmed that even with a ceasefire, the Israelis will continue to dig up and destroy tunnels in the Gaza Strip, giving no specific information as to whether this will include more deadly air raids. For most Palestinians, the diplomatic wrangling is just another sign of the international consent being given to the Israelis. With all their power and influence, Western diplomats are unable to get the Israelis to end the fighting as the body count in Gaza spikes to over 900.
Meanwhile, thousands of protesters across Europe rallied against the ongoing Israeli offensive in the Gaza Strip, while denouncing the killing of civilians in the besieged enclave. Major cities in several European countries included Geneva, London, Berlin and Frankfurt, where thousands of protesters participated in peaceful anti-Israeli rallies, calling for peace and an end to the Gaza blockade. However, a pro-Palestine rally turned violent in the French capital as demonstrators defied a protest ban by the authorities, ending with at least 40 arrests.
I am here to show that this massacre has to come to an end after 66 years. I would also like to make it very clear that we are not against Judaism, but against Zionism. We know, of course, that not all Israelis agree with what is happening. We are here because we support human rights and because we finally want peace.
We're demonstrating for peace in Gaza. The bombardments are inhumane and have caused a humanitarian catastrophe. We would like to point out that these people are suffering. We demand an end to the blockade and a two-state solution with the borders of 1967. We urgently need a ceasefire and a permanent solution for the Palestinian problem.
It really shocks me and touches me to see all the people who are deprived of everything, seeing their houses being destroyed. It's because I am really tired, and to see that, when we say we are all Palestinian, it is really because it concerns all of humanity, and we have to react. It's not tolerable. It's monstrous to see this.
Militants belonging to the so-called Islamic State are continuing their desecration of religious sites in Iraq's second city of Mosul. After driving out the Christian community from the city, extremists are continuing to destroy churches and mosques that date back hundreds of years.
This is what a campaign to establish an Islamic caliphate looks like. Well, at least according to the Al-Qaeda offshoot of the so-called Islamic State. The group has engaged in a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing, expelling Christians and other Muslim sects and destroying Iraq's cultural heritage. The latest casualty was a shrine in the northern Iraqi city of Mosul. IS blew up the tomb of Nabi Sheet or Prophet Seth. 2 days ago, militants leveled the shrine of Nabi Yunus or Prophet Jonah. The Nabi Yunus Mosque, a towering structure that housed the shrine, was also destroyed in Thursday's blast. Previously, the IS had carried out numerous bombings, destroying the shrine of the Prophet Daniel west of Mosul, the shrine of one of the grandchildren of the second Caliph Omar bin al-Khattab, as well as several mosques. Numerous churches have also fallen victim to the Al-Qaeda militants' destructive touch. Earlier in the day, militants blew up the Virgin Mary Church in central Mosul, while another, the Holy Spirit Church east of Mosul city, was reported to be rigged with explosives. It's not only just the holy sites that the group has in its crosshairs. There are desecrated graves in the city, where statues of famous figures and other cultural locations have also been destroyed. Perhaps the biggest victim in all this is the idea of coexistence between different religion and confessions in Iraq. The violence in the de facto Iraqi capital of the Caliphate has forced thousands of Iraqi Christians to pour out of Mosul. They have been given an ultimatum to either convert to Islam, pay a tax, flee, or face death. Mosul was once a symbol of religious intermingling and tolerance in Iraq. But with the arrival of Islamic State militants, it seems that the idea of tolerance is becoming a distant memory.
Let's speak to Aida Samhiri. She is an Iraqi Christian activist. Aida, is the end very near for Christians in Iraq?
Well, without any intervention from the international communities, it will definitely be the end. And I have to remind the world that this persecution did not start now. It started when the United Kingdom and the States left a massive, massive vacuum in Iraq, creating the Christian plight. And it's worsening every day, and it has been kept unreported.
Why has the international community been so silent over the Christian plight most recently?
The current government, we feel, in the West is very non-interventionist. We have to look back into history with Bush and Blair, who went into war with the wrong agenda and have taken the West into an unjust war. And today the West are doing the complete opposite and are washing their hands and are having a very hands-off policy. And I suppose they do not want to get involved because draining the economy is not an election winner, and they're cutting their losses.
Has the media failed to shed light on the issue because it would create an outcry among Christians in Europe and the US against the situation in Iraq?
I don't think media has highlighted the issue at all. And if you troll the internet, you will find imageries and videos of showing atrocities. And if the media decides to act, then I hope that the international communities will follow.
But soon this will become a regional issue where Christians are persecuted in countries like Lebanon. Won't it be too late for any decisive action then?
No, it is an emergency for the entire Middle East. This is an ISIS and Iraq issue at the moment, and they are being persecuted by fundamentalist group in the name of Islam. Christians and Muslims coexisted and lived side by side, and now they are both being ethnically cleansed. Christians and Muslims too, who do not share and comply to ISIS views.
Today we witnessed the destruction of 2 historic churches in Mosul. Do you think the world owes Middle Eastern Christians for the spiritual and cultural heritage that they have maintained in the Middle East for thousands of years?
Yes, of course. I mean, may I remind you that Iraq was the cradle of civilization and Christianity. There were churches in Iraq way before there were churches in Europe. And culture and heritage are being destroyed. And it is fundamental to protect these. Otherwise, the fabric of Iraq will be altered forever. Imagine Lebanon without Christians.
As an Iraqi Christian, will you ever go back to Iraq and live there given the current dangers?
No, I will not, but I will keep on fighting for the sanctity of all religion and most importantly for the sanctity of humankind and life.
All right, Aida Samhiri, an Iraqi Christian activist, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this.
Thank you very much.
Staying in Iraq, where the country's military is stepping up its air and ground operations against Islamic State militants. In recent days, Baghdad has reported a number of advances across the country, including Diyala, Salah ad-Din and Anbar provinces.
The continued wide-range military operations and airstrikes on the militant-held territories and strongholds have given warfare privileges to Iraq's army against Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant militants. As over the past couple of days, Iraqi armed forces with the volunteer forces have been able to achieve significant battlefield accomplishments. According to military sources, Iraqi army with allied volunteer forces have managed to establish multiple defensive lines, known as Repel Line, straddling the areas in Iraq's eastern Diyala province, moving through Salahuddin province, and ending with Anbar province in east of the country, where the armed forces are amassing to block any potential flow of arms and ammunitions into the militant-held territories, and to halt any further militant advances. Moreover, Iraqi defense officials said that over the past few days, many cities and towns in Diyala and Salahuddin provinces have been regained.
والقوات الأمنية لا زالت تستمر بتنفيذ.
The results of increasing the coordination between the Iraqi armed forces and the counter-terrorism forces, many military operations have been launched in Salahuddin, Diyala and Anbar provinces. The operations killed hundreds of ISIL members and destroyed a large number of militants' trucks.
Also conducted military operations in Fallujah Bridge and Ar-Rutba in the west of Anbar province, Bi'aj district in western Mosul, Hemrin area in Diyala province, and Dulu'iyya and Beji in Salahuddin province, about 130 kilometers north of Baghdad. More than 100 ISIL senior militants were killed as a result of the airstrikes and tank shelling, and Iraqi military could capture and destroy a huge number of militants' vehicles carrying weapons and ammunitions.
Iraqi security forces could successfully purge the ISIL militants out of Hemrin area, as 50 ISIL were killed, whereas tens of ISIL foreign nationals affiliates have been captured and submitted to interrogation.
Furthermore, Iraqi Defense Ministry reported that military operations are continued against the ISIL militants in Jarf al-Sahar district in Babla province, about 60 kilometers southwest of Baghdad, and Al-Jalam area 20 kilometers south of Tikrit in Salahuddin province, while Iraqi security forces are fiercely clashing with the extremist militants on Baghdad's outskirts. The militants have been desperately implementing multiple suicide car bombings and planting bombs in areas around the army defensive lines in a bid to prevent Iraqi army's further advances to Mosul. Rihab Rikabi, Al-Ittijah, Baghdad.
Well, Kurdish forces in control of checkpoints in parts of the northern city of Mosul, which was occupied by militants belonging to the so-called Islamic State last month, claim they are keeping their guard over possible extremist attacks.
Driving through the last checkpoint in the Kurdish-controlled region of Mosul in northern Iraq means you're about to cross onto the other side of the line, the part of the city which fell into the hands of militants from the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria during last month's operations. There's only a mound separating the two forces. The checkpoints occupied by Peshmerga troops belonged to the Iraqi army before soldiers were forced out of the northern city. Now these forces say they are on the lookout for possible extremist attacks.
We now keep guard here to ensure security. Whether we will push forward, we will have to wait for orders.
The current war situation is a great pressure to us. The Islamic State is a dangerous threat to the region and the world. They are a terrorist political body.
Local residents have fled Mosul seeking refuge in Erbil, the capital of the semi-autonomous Kurdistan region.
Our life in Iraq has been destroyed. Our children should be the future of our country, but now they don't have a future. It's all been destroyed.
But it's not just the lives of these refugees that have been destroyed. Iraq is now grappling to fight an extremist militant movement that has wrecked the country's political and security situations and left Baghdad and Erbil more at odds than ever before.
You're watching Al-Ittijah World News, still to come. EU expands its sanctions against Russian nationals. Welcome back to Anitija World News. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Israeli forces resume their onslaught on the Gaza Strip as the Palestinian death toll exceeds the 1,000 mark. It's crunch time in Paris. An army of international diplomats push for a long-term ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. Thousands rally across European cities protesting against the Israeli aggression in Gaza. And militants in Iraq continue with their destruction of the country's heritage, levelling more mosques and churches in Mosul. The European Union has expanded its sanctions against Russian nationals and companies over Moscow's position on the Ukraine crisis. The new list targets 15 individuals as well as 18 companies, including the director of Russia's Federal Security Service and the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence. EU officials claim that the two men were involved in shaping the policy of the Russian government, which threatens Ukraine's independence. Well, it's now been almost 10 days since the Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 was downed over eastern Ukraine. But claims and counterclaims, as well as accusations among global superpowers, have shrouded an ongoing international investigation into the incident.
The last two planes carrying the remains of the victims from Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 arrived in the Netherlands today to be identified and reclaimed by their families. Back in eastern Ukraine, an investigation into the incident is yet to take off the ground due to ongoing attacks on rebel positions by Kiev's troops. But as far as Western governments are concerned, this is the best way forward. This Dutch-led international security force arrived in Kharkiv, not too far from where the plane went down, and is gearing up to provide safety for international investigators once the green light is given. Australia lost 28 of its citizens in the crash, and now its Prime Minister says that the security force is part of a humanitarian mission.
Plainly, there are unrecovered body remains in the area, and it's the presence of unrecovered remains that makes it more important than ever that an international team be dispatched to the site to recover remains, to assist investigation and to obtain justice.
Despite the fact that no investigation has been conducted into the crash, Washington has decided to rely on social media, continuing to accuse Russia of somehow being complicit in the downing of the Malaysian airliner. A White House spokesman claimed that US officials have seen that there were heavy weapons moved from Russia to Ukraine, that they have moved into the hands of separatist leaders. And according to social media reports, those weapons include the SA-11 system. Earlier this week, Russian Lieutenant General Andrei Kartopolov posed some serious questions to Kiev, such as why one of their Su-25 fighter jets was flying along a civilian aviation corridor at almost the same time and at the same level as flight MH17.
Political analyst Robert Altz joins us now from London. Robert, is there really a motive for rebels in eastern Ukraine to down a civilian airliner? Wouldn't this create more complications for them?
You're absolutely right. There is no motive for the rebels in the east of Ukraine who are fighting to confirm their own self-determination and to reject the rule of what they perceive to be the illegal rule of Kiev. They have absolutely nothing to gain from this. Absolutely no one has anything to gain from the tragedy of the shooting down of flight MH17, apart from the Ukrainian government, the current Kiev authorities, who are using this very sad occurrence, this deep tragedy, to call for NATO to join their fight in earnest against those in the east of their country, in effect their own civilians, their own citizens. So no one has anything to gain apart from the authorities in Kiev, who, of course, if they're to be believed that there claims that the rebels had these weapons, then they should not have been allowing flights over their territory in the first place. The responsibility for safe airspace and, of course, passage of planes rests with the government in Kiev. They have the power to say to airlines not to fly over their territory. They knew there was a war going on. If indeed as their claims are to be believed, that the rebels have these weapons, then of course they should not have been allowing these flights to fly over Ukraine in the first place. That is where authority ultimately rests, and they're the ones who are using this sad, deep tragedy, this massive loss of life, for their own political ends.
The West is claiming that MH17 was shot down with an anti-aircraft system, as you just said there. But do Eastern rebels have the capability of carrying out such a highly technical and logistically difficult attack?
Well, one thing that we can be quite certain of is the allegations that this weapon was supplied by Russia just several days before the shooting down of flight MH17 is in fact not true. The United States is continuing to make this accusation, but without supplying any evidence. These systems, these weapon systems, do actually exist within Ukraine. The Ukrainian government has them, and there is a chance that they were actually captured, or some were actually captured by the rebels. They were not directly supplied by Russia. That is something we can be quite certain of. Whether there has been some degree of Russian involvement, no one can actually be sure. But the fact is, it's looking quite certain now that this was actually captured, if indeed this was the weapon that was used, it was actually captured from the Ukrainian government, the current Ukrainian authorities, and then in the hands of the rebels. It is, of course, a system that can be operated by people with very little training. It doesn't actually require a great degree of instruction. That's one reason why Russia may not actually have been directly involved in it. But again, the Ukrainian authorities have at various times denied that these weapons exist within Ukraine. Now, of course, we know that they do, and it's likely that they're actually captured by the rebels, if indeed it was the rebels that shot down this plane, some months before the actual shooting down of flight MH17.
Is this just the latest attempt to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism and impose more sanctions on them?
It is indeed a political act, these sanctions, to try and restrict Russian influence in the world, which is deeply regrettable. Now, when, of course, we talk about state-sponsored terrorism, we need to remember that the current authorities in Ukraine, the Kiev government, are attacking civilians in the east of the country. They are not just fighting the rebels, they are fighting the people in the east of the country who have voted in a referendum to have self-determination, to decide their own future. And in this conflict, civilians are being killed. That is possibly one reason why the rebels shot down aircraft, because aircraft are being used to attack civilians in the east of this country day in and day out. That is not something that is currently reported to a great length in the Western media. It's really being hushed up, whilst the Ukrainian authorities, which are supported by the United States and the European Union and NATO, are attacking civilians in the east of the country as well as the rebels. What Russia has been arguing for is that there needs to be a political dialogue in the east of Ukraine. There needs to be a political settlement which will allow for the federation of that country, because it is in reality a failed state, and to allow the East to decide its own future at a time that would be appropriate. That seems a much better way forward than the military campaign conducted by the current authorities in Kiev, fully supported by the West, which is resulting in much loss of life, massive loss of life that have occurred since this conflict began, which largely began as a result of the European Union's actions in the United States sponsored overthrow of the now former president Yanukovych.
Yes, let's say that the West does manage to pin the rebels. Won't this give the Kiev authorities the international green light to crush them, and their whole objective of creating a state of their own will be nothing?
Yes, indeed, it is an attempt to crush them. They're using military force at the moment, using air power to bomb civilians, using the armed forces against the rebels in the east of the country. And of course, they're also using sanctions and political and economic weapons to try and limit Russia's sphere of influence, to try and limit Russia as an independent state, an independent actor on the international stage, to try and make sure that Ukraine is fully within the Western orbit. And this is despite the severe reservations of the people in the east of the country who do not want to have closer ties with the European Union and the West for very good reasons, often cultural, political, but also economic reasons, actually want to have closer ties with Russia. These people should be listened to and respected and not forced into a political association agreement, an economic and also foreign policy association agreement with NATO and the European Union and close ties with the United States, when of course people in the East have deep reservations about that. So really the West should stop bullying the people of the east of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian government should stop attacking civilians there, and then there will be peace and of course hopefully a political resolution to the conflict, which has claimed many civilians' lives, not just the people in the east of Ukraine, but of course now many Dutch people and people from around the world who sadly died when the plane crashed.
All right, political analyst Robert Olds, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this.
Thank you.
Militants belonging to the so-called Islamic State have reportedly killed at least 85 Syrian soldiers during battles near the northern province of Raqqa. The British-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said that government troops lost control of an army base in the area, but the militants failed to enter the site after more clashes ensued, killing 28 insurgents. The organisation added that some of the executed troops were beheaded and that their bodies and severed heads put on display in Raqqa city. The Al-Qaeda-affiliated al-Nusra Front has released a video of a US suicide bomber blowing himself up near a Syria army post in northwestern province of Idlib. Munir Muhammad Abu Salha is the first American national to carry out such an attack in Syria. The US State Department confirmed the bomber was an American national who traveled from Florida to Syria in 2013. 4 Yemeni soldiers have been killed and 2 others wounded in an overnight attack by Al-Qaeda militants. The assault targeted a military post near the central town of Bayda. Security sources said militants from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula also torched several army vehicles before fleeing the scene. Afghanistan's election commission suspended the auditing process of 8.1 million votes cast in the presidential runoff poll earlier this year, after the 2 candidates failed to reach an agreement on the procedure for invalidating votes. The Independent Election Commission has decided to temporarily suspend the vote audit until the 4th day of Eid al-Fitr to allow the candidates to sort out their differences. French officials have speculated that poor weather conditions caused the crash of Air Algérie flight in Mali, which killed 118 people on board. Investigators at the scene of the crash concluded that the aircraft broke apart when it smashed into the ground, ruling out the possibility of a terrorist attack. As the humanitarian crisis worsens in South Sudan, many are fleeing to neighbouring Sudan. Now, the UN is reporting that over 100,000 refugees have taken shelter in the country. As our Khartoum correspondent Ahmed Saeed Ahmed reports now, that number looks set to rise.
According to the UN Humanitarian Coordination Office in Sudan, 100,000 civilians from South Sudan crossed over into Sudan, fleeing the conflict in their country.
Sudan is capable now of providing health and education, water and security services, so South Sudanese refugees will continue to come to Sudan. Sudan does not mind these refugees. It has even offered them the opportunity to work if they choose to.
The number is expected to rise to 160,000 by the end of the year, according to a weekly report issued by the same office. The UN, however, affirmed that the refugees are in dire need of food, shelter and health care.
South Sudanese refugees have fled to White Nile State and some even came to Khartoum State. They need financial help, but that alone is not enough. Also, since the drop in oil production due to the conflict in South Sudan, Sudan's ability to provide help is undercut. With more numbers, Sudan will need help regarding the provision of services to the refugees.
The increase in the number of refugees was caused by two major elements.
The more battles in the South Sudanese states neighboring Sudan pick up, the number of refugees will increase. This is coupled by the Sudanese government's declaration that it will host the refugees and treat them as citizens.
South Sudan is struggling through a difficult period, even more so now that the negotiations are on hold. But its citizens are struggling through an even bigger difficulty, with more of them having to flee to Sudan and other neighboring countries on account of the war raging in their home country. Ahmed Saeed Ahmed, Al-Ittijah News Channel, Khartoum.
A massive sandstorm swept through the U.S. city of Phoenix in the state of Arizona, causing panic among residents and traffic jams across the city. Check out this aerial video. That's a giant sand cloud moving across the city, swallowing major highways and slowing traffic as people made their way home during rush hour. Wild wolf pups, a $1 million treasure trove, and a 5-kilo rat. Here's a look at some other interesting stories making news.
Mexico's first litter of wild wolf pups, born in captivity, went on display for the first time in Mexico City's San Juan de Aragon Zoo, as conservationists tried to save the species that went wild about 3 decades ago. Born on April 21st, the 3-month-old litter consists of 5 healthy Mexican wolf pups, 3 boys and 2 girls. They are currently being housed in a center especially designed for the reproduction of the species. Peru expects to raise at least $1 million by auctioning off dozens of gold watches and jewelry seized from the country's now jailed former intelligence chief, Vladimiro Montesinos. The trove of riches is a reminder of the flashy lifestyle of Montesinos, who fled the country on a yacht in 2000 after a leaked video of him bribing a lawmaker set the stage for the collapse of former President Alberto Fujimori's government. A huge rat weighing about 5 kilograms was caught in a grain market in southwest China. A man surnamed Han said he discovered the rat. The region's wildlife protection station identified it as a Chinese bamboo rat, a species of rodents sold in Chinese food markets because its meat is said to be delicious and nutritious, and its fur soft and thick.
Here's a recap of our top stories. Israeli forces resume their onslaught on the Gaza Strip as the Palestinian death toll exceeds the 1,000 mark. It's crunch time in Paris. An army of international diplomats push for a long-term ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. Thousands rally across European cities protesting against the Israeli aggression in Gaza. And militants in Iraq continue with their destruction of the country's heritage, leveling more mosques and churches in Mosul. Well, that's all from me and the Al-Ittijah News team. Thank you for watching and good night.